Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about the decisions writers make about their stories. Quite often, when we read a novel, when we watch a film, when we watch a TV show, we see the thing in front of us. And quite rightly, that's what we judge, that's what we evaluate, that's what we look at. But every aspect of that was decided. And one of the really useful exercises is thinking about what decision was made, how it was made, what other things could have been done to understand the process, to understand the focus, to understand what the writer or author was trying to convey. And when we look at a film or a TV show or a novel, sometimes those questions are very difficult. So you look at it and you go, but this is what happened. And adaptation gives us two things: a source text and a new narrative. And that way we can evaluate some of these things and try to understand the process. But because we quite often feel very strongly about source texts, particularly book readers when it comes to filmic adaptations of books, we go, this is how it was in the book. Why is that different in the filmic version? And again, we lose sight of some of the different decisions. And one of the ways of evaluating this is looking at biopics, because a biopic or biopic takes from the real, takes a real life event or an aspect of history and turns it into a narrative. And we can see these decisions in progress. We can see some of these different aspects because we have actual facts based in reality that we can compare to what was created from them, the narrative that was created from them. And quite often, narrative serves a very different purpose. And there are lots of different types of narrative. There are lots of different focuses. There are lots of different reasons for these things. But the one I want to talk about today, you don't need to have seen this film. You don't need to know anything about the history of the character that, or the person the film is based on, because I'm going to go through what I think are some salient points that illustrate some of these decisions. So this is not about whether these are good decisions or bad decisions. This is not about evaluating it in terms of making a judgment about quality. What I want to do with this is show what the film did, what the real life was, and think about the reasons why certain decisions were made, the considerations that go into that, and why sometimes when we look at it, we go, I don't agree with this decision. And it gives us a rationale for it. It helps us explain why we do that, the different things we might consider. So the film I want to look at is a film called Gran Turismo. And this is going to be spoilers for the film, but it is based in real life. So like, you know, it actually happened. It's a bit like, oh, this is film based on World War II. Oh, well, spoiler alert. You're going to find out what happened in World War II. In essence, this film is framed as an underdog story. It is framed as a rags to riches story. And it's focused on the person, Jan Mardenborough, who was a British race car driver. So this is the film version, and Mardenborough is played by is it, Madekwe, young actor. And in the film, he is set up as a young British guy who has always been interested in racing. He comes from a family where his father doesn't understand his obsession with racing. And he'd initially gone to university to study racing mechanics, but then dropped out and has spent a lot of time playing the computer game Gran Turismo and got very, very good at it. And it's set up, we see the family dynamic, we have that whole introduction, Who is he? What type of person is he? What type of life does he lead? His family doesn't understand his passion and his drive. You can see everything being set up. And there's a whole sequence that shows that even though he isn't a professional driver, he's never gotten into a car. He is an exceptionally good driver because he has spent so much time playing this computer game, this racing simulator. And he wins a place in Nissan's first GT Academy. And the whole premise of this is this marketing guru has gone to Nissan and said, I want you to sponsor an academy where we're going to take sim racers, these people who play this computer game, and we're going to turn them into actual race car drivers. So there's this whole competition, and Mardenborough qualifies, and he gets a place at the academy. We follow the whole montage and sequence of small scenes where he's training and things aren't going well and things are difficult. But each time there's a small hurdle, he overcomes it and he moves on until he gets to the sort of the final race of the academy, and he wins it by milliseconds. He squeaks through. And now Nissan is going to give him a racing contract. And so then we follow the next couple of races that he goes through. And each time, like he seems to be doing well, and then something goes wrong. And eventually it all comes down to this race. And yes, he qualifies and he gets his international racing license. And then a terrible incident happens at the Nürburgring racetrack, and his car leaves the track. Some spectators are injured, and one is tragically killed. Mardenborough is in hospital. He's on his own in Germany. He doesn't want to talk to his family. He's dealing with this stress, and of course, his mentor figure comes in and takes him back out, get back on the horse, gets him back in a car. They drive around the track, and then it all basically comes down to a final race at 24 Hours in Le Mans. And he and a team of other sim racers race Le Mans, and they come in third. They have a podium finish. That's the film. It's a rags to riches underdog story. You can see all the way through how each time it's introduction, inciting event, here's this competition. Then we move on to all of the hurdles he has to overcome. We get to this sort of climax point where is he going to give up? Is he going to fail? And then we get the sort of the falling action of it's coming towards its conclusion, and we need those moments, and it's building up to this final thing. And is it all going to come good? Yes. And we get that sort of conclusion. He succeeds. And then we sort of get the information at the end that he went on to have a very successful racing career. That's the film in a nutshell. I've skipped out a lot of detail, but that's essentially it. And in it, we have the main plot is obviously, or the main storyline is obviously about Jan Mardenborough, about his journey as a racer. But it is made up of the subplot with the mentor relationship with the former racer who is now his sort of mentor and teacher and chief engineer who guides him through the races. We have this minor subplot about a romance interest and him sort of growing up and dating this girl. We have the relationship with the father and how initially the father just doesn't understand. And then finally, at the very end, at Le Mans, the father understands and is supportive. We have all of these different elements, and you can see it's to be slightly harsh about it, it is a by the numbers, hitting all the major points of all of the sort of stereotypes or required elements of a rags to riches underdog story. Now, let's compare this to the actual life of Jan Mardenborough. So this is the real Jan Mardenborough, the real person. And interestingly, he did stunt driving for this film. He actually got in and did a lot of the racing driving for the character Jan Mardenborough. And if you notice here on this line, I've put up the actual dates when things happen. And you start noticing a couple of little differences. So in 2011, Martinborough did indeed qualify for Nissan's or GT Academy, but it was the third one. It wasn't the first one. And his father was a professional football player. He did come from this background and grew up in Wales and then in, I think, southern England. But once he qualified for the academy, the final race that the film showed, where he won by milliseconds, he actually won by 8 seconds. And when you think of motor racing, 8 seconds is a big gap. There's a complete lack of tension there. And he was awarded a racing contract with Nissan. That, that was the deal. So they then sent him to a driving camp to teach him to be a race car driver, to give him the experience. And he did the national races well enough. And in 2013, 2 years later, that's when he raced at Le Mans. And he finished third in class, but ninth overall, because Le Mans is slightly more complicated than the film made out. And then in 2015, that's when the Nürburgring incident occurred. That's 2 years after the Le Mans race. And then in 2016, he moved to Japan. So already we can see some key differences that the filmmakers made to Mardenborough's life, this real person, this real history. And it's only just over a decade ago. Like we're talking in the last 10 years. So this isn't ancient history where we're fudging a lot of stuff. And the first thing we can see is, in order to turn this into an underdog story, they exaggerated and increased, they heightened those elements. Because what's the difference between Mardenborough qualifying in the third GT Academy or the first GT Academy? Well, there's no major thing except this was the first time it was ever done, and that heightens it. So you can see what they were going for. Winning the final race by 8 seconds or winning it by milliseconds, increasing the drama. And then we think, well, why move the Nürburgring incident? So if we think in terms of story, in the actual Jan Mardenborough's life, this big concluding highlight event, this huge race that he came third in class, 24 hours at Le Mans, which is like a really important race, that is a natural dramatic end point. But a key aspect of his life, a key aspect of what happened to him on his journey becoming a race car driver, was the Nürburgring incident. So they actually moved it forward in time, and they used it as a challenge for the hero, as this dark moment that he has to try and overcome. And then coming back from that to then go on and win the race. Again, we see this elevation of the drama, the elevation of the tension. And we end the story on a high note because we had that low of this terrible incident that happens, this very tragic incident. And then he picks himself back up. He gets back in the car. He faces this challenge and slowly climbs out until he becomes triumphant. So you can see how they took the elements of someone's life and they rearranged it to give this heightened form of reality, this heightened form of drama, this elevated form. But it raises a number of questions, because when we look at the real Mardenborough's life, this is pretty stunning and dramatic stuff. Someone goes from never having been in a race car before, only playing racing sims, to winning a place where he gets put in a race car and succeeds. From that moment on, he becomes and is a competent, qualified racer. This is a pretty stunning, interesting story. So why add in all of those other elements? And you can see a lot of it is to increase this drama. And interestingly, here's another thing. Quite often I talk about the focus of a story or what the narrative is trying to tell us or what the narrative perspective is focused on. If we think of that tragic incident at the Nürburgring, in that a spectator was tragically killed. Other spectators were injured. Mardenborough's car left the track. It caught some air. It was too light because it didn't have enough fuel in it to hold it down. There was a gust of wind. There were a whole load of different elements led to this incident. If this was a biopic, if this was a documentary, we would expect focus on who that victim was who tragically lost their life. We would expect details about their life. But in the film version, the focus remains entirely on Mardenborough, how this affected him, because it's his story that is being told. So it's all about the impact of this on him. Someone died in real life within the last decade, but the film chooses not to go into those details. The film focuses on the impact on Mardenborough, on the mental toll that this takes, the guilt that he feels. Its focus remains on him. And so this incident and this tragic loss of life is being used as an inciting event or a complication to Mardenborough's journey. So the focus remains on Mardenborough and it's not giving equal weight or investigation into the victim. And that raises an interesting ethical question, because if we do this in absolute fiction, if we focus on an aspect of the trope of fridging is about this, where here's a character, the character is killed off to provide motivation for the main character. And that's what has essentially been done here, except this is real life. This was a real person, family, friends affected by this. And none of that is the concern of this narrative. So, as an ethical question, when you're dealing with actual people and not just characters, this is clearly something that is debated and discussed in the writer's room. Can you use this tragic event that happened in real life and ignore the real life consequences on the other people to further the narrativization of this hero's journey story that you're creating? And I think it gives that stark illustration, because when it comes to fictional characters, we can be, I think, slightly more forgiving because they are not real. Characters, as rounded as they can be, are still elements of a plot function. They are still there to further elements of the story, to explore certain things. They are tools. But in this instance, because it is based in the real, because it is based in history, because it is based in what actually happened, that person isn't a plot function. And turning a real person into a plot function, particularly in these circumstances, raises ethical questions. And so, what I find fascinating about all of this is I think it illustrates how narrative, particularly filmic and TV, quite often simplify real life. They reorganize real life to make it neater, more streamlined, to fit with a narrative paradigm. And that gives us insight into what narratives generally do. They are, no matter how complex they are, and there are a lot of very complex narratives out there, but when we think about stories, even very complicated films with lots of moving parts. They are simplifications in a lot of respects of real life. They are limited in their focus. They have a very specific focus. And so understanding how you tweak and change things, even things that you don't think need to be changed. Why change it from the third GT Academy to the first? Is that increase in dramatic tension worth it? This new thing that's being done, it's still relatively new if it's the third one. But you can see by making it the first one, it heightens the dramatic tension and it simplifies it. Because if we had found out it was the third one, we go, well, what happened to the winners of the first two? Why aren't we following them? Why are we following the winner of the third one? Winning that final race at the Academy by milliseconds, it adds that dramatic tension. Is he going to win? Is he going to lose? Oh, it's coming down to the wire. It's increasing dramatic tension because him leading by a full 8 seconds means that you know that he's won the race long before he crosses the finish line by moving that decision right down to the wire, right down to the finish line, and then waiting on the photo finish increases dramatic tension. But you then weigh up, is it worth it? Is it worth changing the reality to make it more dramatic? Moving something like the Nürburgring incident forward to become this dark moment, the belly of the whale, Mardenborough at his lowest mental point. You can see how it makes sense in terms of narrative, because that is the thing that now must be overcome for him to reach the peak, the triumph of being at Le Mans. And with that, you can see how by having that trough, that dark moment, it makes the end shining bright moment shine that much brighter by contrast. We can see how that works and we understand how that works in narrative. But when we're dealing with real life, well, we're just shuffling around people's lives. So I think it illustrates a lot of these things. And again, this is not about, was this a good decision? Was this a bad decision? Do we like it? Do we not like it? But when we start applying that to our understanding of story, to our understanding of any of these narratives that we perceive, we get a sense of this structure of story that people sometimes apply. And when they think in terms of, and I think this film is a good example of this, a very narrow prescriptive formula for what they are doing when they're looking at a beat sheet and going, I need this moment here, I need this moment here. What aspects of this life can we move to there to provide that beat? That's the sort of thing that can make something feel formulaic, can make something feel generic. Although I dislike people using generic in that term, but that's what adds to it, because when we can start predicting when these moments land as if it is being written to a very strict formula, that removes some of our engagement, or at least can. Same time, if it's done interestingly, we can become more invested in it because we're comfortable with the structure, we're comfortable with the pattern. And so I think a lot of these things are really interesting. So if you have the opportunity, it's not a particularly long film, but if you're interested in how narrative structure works, if you're interested in how these patterns emerge, I think Gran Turismo is actually a great film to look at, because we can compare it directly to the sequence of events and we can see what they chose to excise, what they chose to move. And in doing so, we understand then how they create the pattern in the story and the type of story that they want. Why they are focusing on, let's make it an underdog story, let's make it a rags to riches story, looking at the elements of how they do that. Because Mardenborough's father was a professional football player. It's not that he is coming from a destitute background, and yet they kind of subtly emphasize that it's not a particularly wealthy or well-off family. We see lots of images and sequences that lean into that to imply, without right stating, that they're not wealthy. And that makes his success even greater. It's all little things like this. And I think this is a great film that illustrates that. So again, this is not about, well, I agree with this or I don't agree with this, or I think that was a bad idea or a good idea. It's about using what they did as a way of understanding why they did it. And then that can lean into our understanding and even evaluation and judgment of the text. But it gives us a better understanding of formulaic storytelling, story beats, story focus, the streamlining of the complexity of details into creating something that does follow a specific journey, a specific focus that simplifies things. Because if I said, oh, such and such a book, well, it simplified that. People sometimes, I think, misunderstand that as, no, but this is really complex. The level of complexity that we find in fiction is quite often a very superficial level of complexity. Although there are a lot of moving parts, it's nowhere near as complex as real life. And I think this film actually helps us understand that point, that it's not that the narrative is simplistic, but it has simplified, and surface level complexity is quite easy to navigate. But that's kind of what I wanted to say about this. I think it is a very useful case study. I think it's a very useful example of how decisions get made, how things can be narrativized, how things can be restructured and reorganized to create dramatic effects, to create impact in the audience. And that's what fiction does. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.